third session here is going to be, in our last session we looked at the difference between introverted sensing with extroverted intuition. So we're kind of staying in the same two functions, but we're going to look at the reverse of them. So just to kind of go over what we looked at with introverted sensing was that the introverted sensing is a very almost subjective approach to sensing, that the sense world is taken in impressionistically, aesthetically, in a kind of impressionistic manner, and that certain details are latched onto and seen in a certain way. That the extroverted sensing has an almost holistic approach, as we will see today, similar to its introverted intuition polarity. That the polarity of introverted intuition, which is really getting at the essence and knowing things deeply and all these internal intuitive processes, has this commonality with the extroverted sensing, where it's taking in the outer world in a very holistic way. Now, at the same time, that introverted intuition also has a commonality with introverted sensing that we looked at last week, which is this impressionistic thing, where introverted sensing was impressionistically taking in memories and, for instance, dreams. The dreams of an introverted sensing person often have fragments and impressions, and it's almost an aesthetic sensing. Whereas here, what we're looking at is going to be a little different. So over this next hour, we will look at some of the changes. And then when we looked at the intuition as well last week, it's so different than what we're going to find here with introverted intuition. Extroverted intuition that we saw last week was all about making connections really in the outer world, or at least if they are introspective philosophical connections, they are somehow formalistic in a way. It's hard to describe, but what we'll find is that the extroverted intuitive that we looked at last week, the reason you find them having so many ideas for different things to try in business and creativity and so on, and really good at improvising, is because their intuition is making connections between different things. It's basically connecting the dots. And introverted intuition also does that, but it does that in order to draw a conclusion in a way that extroverted intuition doesn't. Extroverted intuition is much better at thinking of an exception to a rule rather than drawing a conclusion. It's there for brainstorming. Introverted intuition is there for envisioning. So really excited today just to kind of share some of this with you. And let's take a look at our first slide here. Now, this should be a slide that should be familiar from our last class. These are the four polarities. So this is basically just the four fundamental polarities, and we're currently looking at the second of four. So these four classes, we're going to look at each polarity. Now, remember that the polarity is always between dominant and inferior. The other two can be fairly well balanced as your right and left hand. I mean, it's not that they're totally balanced. One will be preferred over the other, but the other two functions can be relatively balanced to where what we found in our last session, introverted sensing types can have real problems with extroverted intuition and vice versa. Well, the same is true here. So what we're going to find in this session is the exact same thing, that as we're looking at introverted intuitives with extroverted sensing. And you can see this graphic I have here. And so basically this polarity is going to be, we're going to look at it from both sides. We're going to look at what is it to be an introverted intuitive. I myself am an introverted intuitive. And so what it is to feel like life is coming at you, as we've looked at how introverts feel like they're standing still, life is rushing at them, and then they're somehow trying to catch everything that's rushing at them, and they're putting up defense mechanisms against it. And how are they defending against it? Through intuition. An inner intuition, which is really related to knowing. So seeing what they know, trying to put together all the facts and the details, and kind of squint their eyes a little bit. The introverted intuitive is squinting their eyes on the facts. Because remember, the polarity is always going to be a problem, and the extroverted sensory details are always going to be an issue for the introverted intuitive. And then we're going to go over to the other side. We'll look at the extroverted sensing type. So, and we'll see how for them, I mean, it's always the polarity where there's so much charge. That's what's so interesting. There's a lot of charge there. So First of all, just some commonalities with what we found last week. What do we have in common here? We're still in the realm of perceiving. We're still not yet looking at judging types. All of the types we've looked at, what we're looking at today and last week, that is to say, both introverted and extroverted versions of the sensing and the intuitive types. All of these types we're looking at, all four of these types, have this commonality of basically being okay with people. People are nice, people are mean, people are rude, people are polite, people are kind, people are generous, people are selfish, greedy. However you look at it, people have this range of expression that are just allowed to be. Because these are perceiving types that, as we've kind of seen, are fundamentally in the world of things and fundamentally in the world of chaos and control, basically, order and chaos. And so what you're going to find is the introverted sensing type that we saw last week, they really like the control of physical control, sensory control. Well, introverted intuitives really like intuitive control. What does that mean? Control over, it's almost more insidious, control over knowing, control over what people think, control over what people believe. It's like when you're arguing with somebody and they're trying to control what you think or the way you see something. That can be, the good thing is that introverted intuition, at least though, being directed inward, has that common trait of all introverted functions of kind of a live and let live, free to be you and me. I'm my own independent person and life is kind of coming at me, so I'm not really trying to impose my thing on other people. So even though the introverted intuitive, I guess you could kind of characterize them, they think they're right. If you get in an argument with them, then their inner knowing will be your problem, so to speak. But generally speaking, they're not trying to impose their knowing on others. But you can see introverted intuition as the knowing function. In fact, the great Jungian analyst John Beebe uses the term knowing to describe introverted intuition, not extroverted intuition. So again, we have some key differences here. In some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways, in some senses, the introverted and extroverted version of a function are the most different. In some ways. They can endlessly talk with each other and endlessly, never arrive at a conclusion, right? I'm an introverted intuitive. I can endlessly talk with an extroverted intuitive, and I'm always trying to reach some sort of monolithic, conclusive, final judgment or final pronouncement, and they're always looking for exceptions for the rules and brainstorming other ways it could be and other explanations and other. So their whole thing is other. Keep it open, keep it playful, keep it moving, keep it alive, because frozen is dead, and dead is boring. You'll find if you study Enneagram that many extroverted intuitives are Enneagram 7. It's very different from the introverted sense types we saw last week, who are most commonly, they are basically mostly Enneagram 6. Now again, there's quite a range, and I don't want to pigeonhole any Enneagram type to being a certain Jungian type or vice versa. There's just clustering. There's clustering that you see. So it kind of makes sense that there's certain affinities. What we saw last week was that introverted sensing types really have an affinity with what might be considered menial tasks to some of the other types, because they involve a certain humbling before the perfection of practice and rote memorization and even going into the essence of something. Now, I don't want this to only be left variable biased. So for people who are right variable out there, that same introverted sensing thing can be going deeply into the Qigong exercise or going deeply into making food or washing clothes, or it's kind of like that classic Zen monk idea of you're enlightened but you're still doing dishes and you're still carrying water. You're kind of carry water, do dishes. This kind of life of work and liberation of the sensory and the spiritual in the sensory. So that's what you find with the introverted sensing type. The extroverted intuitive are often the type who are kind of caricatured as being usually the city slicker, erudite kind of bored figure, like the Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, or just kind of the wisecracking. So the extroverted intuitive is kind of like the joker, trickster, who doesn't want to be pinned down, who's a chaos spirit and really appreciative of variety and difference and novelty. And so you get this really interesting polarity between like our tether to our past and this sort of novelty-loving figure. Well, for the introverted intuitive and the extroverted sensing, we have to kind of find our own caricatures now. And those caricatures are kind of the introverted intuitive is really the mystic or the shaman, and then the extroverted sensing type is often, depending on if they're which side they kind of go to, they're either just the very utilitarian, mechanically inclined, physically inclined, sensorially inclined, or they're like a chef and they love food and they're kind of, maybe they're world travelers or they're adventurers or they're exciting and they drive fast cars, and there's something kind of sexy and cool about extroverted sensing. And then you find introverted intuition, and that can be the macabre, the weird, the eccentric, the unusual, the bizarre, all of these things that get kind of thrown into the world of introverted intuition, simply because there's a lot more extroverted sensing people than introverted intuitives out there. So you do see this sort of layering by the program of what personality crystals it allows to incarnate, or perhaps it's even some sort of ordering of the hierarchies of personality crystals themselves. I don't really know. But you see that, for instance, by far, you have a lot of extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling types, and then you have a lot of introverted sensing types. And then you start to get the extroverted sensing and the extroverted intuitives, and they kind of come across as the fresh, cool, uncaring, flippant types, because in some ways, because they're the extroverted irrational functions. So we've remained entirely in the realm of the irrational functions so far. All perceiving functions are irrational. These are the perceiving, also called observing functions. And so when we're talking about sensing and intuition, we're in this realm of irrationality, and the extroverted version of that can seem really cool. In different ways, sure, extroverted sensing can seem cool just in its sort of embodied confidence, whereas extroverted intuition can seem clever and witty and kind of tricksterish and so on. But both of them have a really cool quality, I think, because they have a sort of a flippant, uncaring quality of what they're putting out is, I don't really... they're putting out the irrationality of pure observation of the world. I'm just perceiving the world. I'm not in your fearful, judging world. So, and I think the introverted sensing types have that too, but they're more of the control types. So it's almost like if you were to see this hierarchy of like what's most common in the world, mostly extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted sensing. So this is kind of the most common realm. And this is the realm that was called Guardians by Kiersey. They're basically the guardians, the protectors of the past. Usually it's paired with introverted sensing. And then you also have the introverted sensing leads. So you have a great many people who are very much caught up in the social fabric or in the introverted sensing world. Once you start to get to the extroverted irrational functions, you get sort of archetypes of a lot of cool action heroes, things like that, particularly on the sensing level. The intuitive, you get more of the archetype of the classic, snappy, quick-witted, person. So either way, I guess here we're going to now look at. So let me grab this here. So we're looking at. Let's start with. This is a graphic that shows both. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next graphic. Let's start with the extroverted sensing type. So as I was saying, this is kind of a type notoriously known for being cool and interesting and so on. And with their extroverted sensing, they're really pursuing the outer world. They're even merging with the outer world, and they're excited to be a part of it. They're not really fearful of the outer world. They don't have big defenses against the outer world. Now, their sensing can pair with thinking, and it can be a little more practical, or it can pair with feeling, and it can be more of a lover of life and a bon vivant. But either way, even when paired with thinking, the extroverted sensing here really is a lover of life, because it's using the sensory functions to kind of chase life, to invest in the other. Now, unconsciously, they have that introverted intuition there. And that can be where they get a lot of fears and a lot of things kind of come to them in the middle of the night, and they get a lot of profound insight through their visions and journaling and so on, but it might be very hard for them to even start that process. I have a couple examples of extroverted sensing types I can offer here, and there's going to be a great variety, of course, depending on the subtypes and whether it's paired with feeling and thinking and all sorts of other qualities. One is a man named Frenchie, who's got to be around 80 years old now. He was born in 1945, the year World War II ended, and he was born in a concentration camp on a dirt floor. So what does that make him? Yeah, he's 79 years old now. And really a really cool guy, really interesting guy, funny. He's an extroverted sensing lead, and he has such a great voice. I wish I could do it justice with his impression. I mean, I don't even know if he really knows what European country he's from or what his heritage is, because he's like pan-European, but people called him Frenchy because he has a vaguely French accent and has spent time all over Europe in all different places. And I got to meet him in his early 70s, and we would spend some time laughing and so on. And he has this great voice. I can't quite do it, but he would joke that I think he looks like Pinocchio's master because he has this big bushy white mustache, and he's kind of heavy set and bald and laughing. And he would always, and he didn't really speak very good English, but he would say things like, here's how he would talk. He would say, so I'm driving and I see a mushroom and I stop, and police say you can't stop, and I said I'm getting mushrooms here. I'm getting mushrooms, like on the side of the freeway. You know, this is a lover of life. This is an extroverted sensing type. Or he had one. He says, I'm traveling with my brother, and I see mussels. You know, mussels on the side of a rock, and there's a sign that says mussels are toxic, don't do it, you know, and his brother's like, you're gonna die, Frenchie. And then he's like, I cooked them up, butter and wine, and I'm eating them. The next morning I wake up, I say, brother, I am alive, you know, very happy man. He was almost like Mario from Super Mario Brothers or something like that. So just real lovers of life who really have usually a strong sense of basically their physical presence in the world and a strong ability to merge with things. They merge with their car. They merge. It's like when you're kind of told to merge with the baseball when you're playing baseball or you know, something like that. They're very good at merging with their environment and feeling like that environment is an extension of them and part of them. It's this extroverted sensing, so they're flowing out into the environment and really imbuing the environment with themselves or disappearing themselves into it. It's also pretty objective, and it kind of has this superpower that in a time of crisis, time slows down and goes like goosh, 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 like one thing at a time. It's like everything slows down. Other types can experience this. That is when they're going into their extroverted sensing. So this is really one of the superpowers of the extroverted sensing dominant, is that they learn that way. They often learn kinesthetically, or they experience that way, I should say. Like they experience kind of in a slow mode during a crisis or during something exciting happening. Now, if something like that's not happening, they can be very bored and they can not learn at all, right? Because nothing's happening. There's no excitement. There's no crisis. There's no challenge. So you find a lot of extroverted sensing types. Now, knowing what we know from human design about different levels of resilience and how some people might be more or less resilient, you could imagine a color 1 or color 2 lower resilience person who's an extrovert sensing type, who's maybe more of like a food taster or something like that, compared to the firefighters and medics and rescue people. But you find a lot of, definitely the higher resilience extroverted sensing types love the excitement and thrill of the extroverted sensing kind of adrenaline junkie, dopamine junkie thing. Now, you can't generalize because you find all types doing all activities. You find introverted intuitives who are, you know, dopamine junkies and, you know, adrenaline junkies as well. So, and I guess it's not just dopamine. It's probably more on the adrenaline side when you get to risk. But I do know that extroverted sensing, I think it might be related to dopamine. There's different research in cognitive neuroscience and the science of personality type, particularly by researchers like Dario Nardi, and there are associations between the cognitive functions, and people who have, for instance, extroverted sensing, I think probably has pretty low impulse control. They're not very self-controlled. As I was mentioning, their commonality with extroverted intuition is that both of these don't want to be controlled and like chaos. This is something that was observed really, brought into the spotlight through objective personality. But it is something that you will find even in core Jungian understandings of these functions, that the extroverted functions, the extroverted sensing and extroverted intuition functions, so the extroverted perceiving, I should say, or irrational functions, like the freedom to take action. So an extroverted intuitive is going to take an action to adjust the patio chairs on their business or to adjust their programming so they start a new happy hour to attract more customers, the extroverted sensing type is going to also take action, and they're going to go to the market and get some more exotic food to bring in, or change up the menu, or, so there's a very action-oriented bias. There's a kind of, we should take action and keep trying different things, trying it out. Extroverted sensing is really just action-oriented, like very direct in that way. The introverted intuitive is really its opposite in so many ways, and their own introverted, intuition, which is that for just as direct and plain and kind of what you see as, what you get and straight shooting as you can be, they also have a side to themselves, these extroverted sensing types, of the introverted intuition that is this inferior intuition that can completely overwhelm them with irrational fears, fears of ghosts or possessions or being spooked or all sorts of superstitions. There's all sorts of things that can creep in the inferior intuition. Now, this doesn't mean they can't have profound insights. You find extroverted sensing types like Deepak Chopra and Ken Wilber of Integral Studies. They have profound introverted intuitive insights, profound to them and profound to a lot of people, because they might be of a collective nature or imbued with a sort of collective archetypal value. Most introverted intuitives are not going to be so impressed by the profound insights of the extroverted sensing type, only because that introverted intuitive is so familiar with the territory of insight and of having epiphanies that they sort of look at that epiphany and say, okay, yes, that was profound to you, but you're not really able to transfer that to me, and that's okay. I already have my own insights to look into. So, but you really find that the extroverted sensing type has a lot of dominance in the outer world, that they really are oriented towards the sensory world in a way that is not really moralistic, the way that feeling and thinking are. And it's not really concerned about whether it works or not. It's not really concerned about whether people like it or not. It's really, the extroverted sensing type in particular can be very dominant, which can give introverted intuitives a little bit of a complex, which we'll see when we look at the introverted intuitive. But the extroverted sensing dominant, they really are here to take action in the world and to be these action-oriented, very kind of free to try something and try something else if it doesn't work. They don't want to commit their energy, and they don't want to be stuck managing a process with a lot of internal checking to follow the process. They want to be able to manage the process externally. So all of the perceiving functions are process managers. That is to say, the irrational functions are going along, managing the process. It's like cooking food or something, or spinning plates, or like juggling, which is something that extroverted sensing types are often really good at. They're basically managing a process, but they're not really referencing something internally the way that the introverted sensing type is going to, or the introverted intuitive for that matter. The introverted irrational functions are referencing an inner process, an inner journal, an inner note keeping, an inner sort of thing, whereas the extroverted are really looking to the outer world for the cues. And so an extroverted sensing dancer is going to notice when is the right time to turn. They're not going to practice the move as much as they're going to practice being embodied and practice going into that. You find a lot of chefs who are extroverted sensing. You find a lot of photographers, a lot of athletes. Really, of course, they can be of any profession. And you find computer scientists, and you find people of all professions, really. But there is clustering, and you'll see that the extroverted sensing type often learns best kinesthetically, or learns best through their own ability to observe the outer reality, as well as to use things that have a really nice feel and feedback. So they might benefit from learning through VR, for instance, or they might benefit from learning through a really snappy computer interface or a nice car or something like that they can really merge with and feel really good about merging with. If you want to practice your extroverted sensing, regardless of what type you are, you can, next time you're filling up your car, you can imagine, and this is from the Functions by Type book, I believe, you can imagine you're drinking the gas yourself, that you are the car, and it's drinking the gas, and you can be, yum, that you're filling it up. Or it's kind of like when there's all these exercises in this book, Functions by Type, and it's a pretty fun one I don't necessarily agree that all of the exercises really are practicing exactly that function, but it's a pretty cool book. Let's see, functions by type. I'm trying to find the. Well, we'll have to return to that later. Maybe we can do a special where we practice some of these functions, because it is fun regardless of what type you are to try to go into that function. And you could, for instance, also try to practice introverted intuition, which might be like, what impression do you get from, or weighing many factors to kind of come up with different possible outcomes and things like that. Okay, so what else can we say about the extroverted sensing type? This type has a lot in common with the extroverted intuitive, and then a lot different. The commonality is that they're action-oriented, they're freedom-loving in the sense that they don't want to be controlled or laden with a bunch of extra responsibilities. They're usually very successful, as extroverted intuitives can also be. I know that that's not a type thing. There's going to be a wide variance, but still, there's clustering, right? Extroverted sensing types are kind of designed to be successful, or I shouldn't say designed, but oriented at least to be successful in the outer world, because by design, in some sense it is a design, they're oriented to merge with and take over the external world. And they're really to do in a way that, if they're in an extreme form, doesn't have a lot of thinking or feeling involved. Not a lot of moral judgments at all, or even logical judgments, really just a lot of perceiving, a lot of pure irrational perception and action in the outer world. The extroverted intuitive, also there's a clustering that they tend to be pretty successful in things, maybe less so, because there's more applications that they can be used for, like philosopher, they might end up, philosophy professors and novelists and so on, and might end up not being as successful. But you still find that typically extroverted intuitives are very entrepreneurial and really able to go out there in the world and make things happen in the world, take a lot of action in the world, call people up, kind of get things moving. I mean, this is regardless of their human design type. I've noticed this again and again. It's not a manifestor thing. It's not a generator thing. It's that extroverted intuitives are just naturally bouncing around, making a lot of connections, and they're naturally going to have, now certainly there will be differences depending on what subtype of extroverted intuitive they are, but they're just going to kind of naturally have the ability to make a lot of connections in the intuitive world. Now, granted, they may not be such starters depending on their subtype. They may have a subtype of extroverted intuitive that is really biased towards passivity and not really, maybe all they want to do is just consume new information or something. But either way, there is the ability of this function to take action, just like extroverted sensing. So that's the commonality. Now, how are they different? Extroverted sensing, there's really a divide between it and intuition, because it's going to want things to be a little more concrete. It's going to, the extroverted sensing type is really going to get in trouble with drawing conclusions. They need to often go back to square one and start over at the very beginning and take very discrete steps. And it's not like the introverted sensing type where they're kind of only seeing the steps. The extroverted sensing type is seeing the big picture. They need to see the big picture. They need to back up. They need to see context. So they're starting at the beginning to make sure they have the whole picture, because then they can take a step and then the next step and the next step, and they kind of know, say that they're building something. They really want to start at square one. Now, their opposite type, the introverted intuitive, as we will see, is much more comfortable with complexity and much more comfortable with sort of being able to start in the middle and kind of pick up other things and so on. But the extroverted sensing type, it really doesn't want too many sensory details. When too many sense details build up, you need to use intuition to figure out what it means. So they want to keep it simple. KISS principle. Keep it simple, silly, right? You just want to have one kind of basic approach. It's kind of like, here's a good example. You find a lot of extroverted sensing types in film. George Lucas often said to be, now he's actually debatable, but Steven, I think some people think he's like an INTP or something. I don't even know, but I've heard he's an ESFP at least. So arguable. Extroverted sensing. Steven Spielberg, extroverted sensing, pretty clearly. Quentin Tarantino, definitely extroverted sensing type. And when you hear Quentin Tarantino's way of writing a film, it is, here's how he does it. He says, I start with a notebook. Not a fancy notebook, not an expensive notebook, just a notebook, simple notebook, black and white, like you had in school. Take a pen, not a fancy pen, not a crazy, just a pen. Start on page 1. I write the first scene, not the second scene, not the third scene, not that. Just I write the first scene. First scene's finished. I go to the second scene. I don't skip ahead. I don't go to the end. I don't write out the characters. I don't write their backgrounds. None of it. Second scene's done. I go to the third scene. If there's a rewrite, I go back. But unless there's a rewrite, he pretty much doesn't really. He just writes. It's just like keep it as simple as humanly possible. This is the extroverted sensing way, because as soon as too much detail comes up, they need to then go into introverted intuition. They need to suddenly start to make sense of this accumulation of data. So basically the sensing is trying to keep it simple, and they're really trying to merge with the objects and enjoy the objects themselves. It's almost like the film is an excuse to show off the car. The film is an excuse to show off how physically fit they are and how enjoyable and how beautiful it is driving in LA with the sunset and the hair going through the wind going through their hair in the convertible. And that is kind of the reason is just to cruise around and enjoy life. It's like, do you really want more than that? Like, people go to the movies to have fun. Like, shouldn't we just enjoy ourselves? So extroverted sensing can be accused, particularly by introverted intuitives, of being superficial and vapid and just the kind of jocks and cheerleaders of the world who just want to really show off how dominant they are, socially dominant, stuff like that. Now, of course, this is not really even the story. This is just the negative way that extroverted sensing can be depicted by spiteful introverted intuitives, who are rightly called by the extroverted sensors haters, right? This is just haters. But the extroverted sensing type, really, they often do have a lot of money and a lot of success and a lot of enjoyment and pleasure and a lot of respect for having achieved a lot and having, they're kind of just, they can be very popular people. They can be very, people can really look up to them. So even though they can be pretty immoral or amoral, and you find a lot of extroverted sensing types among Enneagram 8, for instance, which can be very antisocial, even criminal, but regardless, people tend to be kind of fascinated by extroverted sensing types. Tony Soprano, the character, and the actor James Gandolfini, extroverted sensing types. We like something about the extroverted sensing and its truthfulness about how objectively and impersonally it treats reality, and just how little it cares, because so many people are so caught up in thinking and feeling in the game of judgment. There's something refreshing about seeing someone who just doesn't care, who's just willing to kind of enjoy life fully and experience life to its fullest. That's at least how the extroverted sensing type is often depicted or seen in different cultural artifacts. Okay, so let's now take a look at the introverted intuitive. So let me see here. Okay, let me get this. Here we go. So the introverted intuitive is, okay, so this is my type, and this is also Dave Powers of the Objective Personality System. And when we're looking at the introverted intuitive, this is really the classic kind of mystical shamanic type. Doesn't mean that all the mystics are introverted intuitives. They can be any type. I've seen mystical people of all types. I imagine Ra Uru Hu is likely an introverted thinking dominant, just as an example. But traditionally, there's a sort of association, at least by Jung and von Franz and others, of the shamanic and mystical forms with intuition, particularly introverted intuition, because introverted intuition has such a predictive power. It's really an incredible predictive power to weigh many factors, and it almost looks like passing a judgment or making a decision. It's like organizing all of these intuitive impressions into a worldview or a framework, which is why it has a huge advantage in that once they know a lot, people can come to them for their knowledge. It's a huge disadvantage in that if something shakes them to their core, they have to throw away everything they know and start over. So the introverted intuitive really has this project of building an internal ideological lattice structure of beliefs and knowledge and almost like you can almost characterize it by what percentage of confidence they have in that statement. Like, oh, I have no confidence whatsoever in this area, but very high confidence in this other area. And having this innate ability to really quickly assess how confident they are to make a particular prediction or not. It's kind of like a magic 8-ball or an oracle that you come to and you say, what do you think will happen here? And they can check their own confidence of, no, I don't think that'll, I have very low confidence, I don't know. Or they have some way of kind of knowing where they do have high confidence because their intuition has somehow, it's almost like doping, like what athletes do when they use, performance enhancing drugs, except that it's the intuition is like the performance enhancing isn't for athletes, it's for knowing and knowledge and philosophy and so on. And so it's basically going into the unconscious, and that's kind of doping the answer, imbuing it with the unconscious. So weirdly, we kind of have two ways of accessing the unconscious. We access it through the introverted intuition, regardless of what our type is, and we also access it through our inferior function. So it's kind of this weird double duty where the introverted intuitive function is the cognitive function that looks inward into its organized knowledge, and what it basically almost looks to the unconscious to deliver a guess, and then it basically bets with its reputation, puts its reputation on the line, and if it's correct in its guess, more times than not, it builds this really good reputation. It's very different than, for instance, an introverted thinking type who is going to check if something is true or false and going to dislike generalizations. The introverted intuitive is more like an AI who has been changing their model and changing their model and changing their model and tweaking it and throwing it away and starting over and building new ones and building on different areas of their model and doing all this stuff with their model, and then they run stuff through the model and answers come out. And if it's a good model, you can use those answers, but they don't really know how they got the answer. So the introverted thinking type is kind of a classic nemesis of the introverted intuitive. They're in the same domain, the same realm of the inner world of thoughts and ideas and feelings and all of these things, but they each have certain advantages. The introverted thinking type has this great advantage of being able to apply this judging function, but the introverted intuitive has its own advantage of being able to create models that can produce seemingly magical results. How did you know that person was this? How could you tell that this person was this type just from the way they walked? An introverted intuitive can do some sort of intuitive gait analysis to get information without knowing how they knew that information. And it's not channeled from some other place, it's from their own unconscious. They're basically accessing some inner knowledge that most other people have but don't necessarily have access to, or not regularly, not autonomously. Okay, so to be an introverted intuitive now, let's look at this graphic and we can see that they're consciously aware of all of that libido energy moving towards them. They're unconsciously aware of their extroverted sensing. And this inferior extroverted sensing can really make the introverted intuitive, it can make them come across in some sort of bizarro. There's actually a really nice article by IDR Labs on Christopher Hitchens, himself an introverted intuitive, where they said he would get into this bizarro extroverted sensing, where in his writing he would often make fun of extroverted sensing people as kind of plebeian or basic, but yet he himself was jealous of them because he wanted to be this sort of alpha male figure, so he would try to take them down a notch and trump himself up and so on, and pump himself up through basically this intellectual superiority complex. I would imagine Nietzsche was likely an introverted intuitive as well. Some people type him as an introverted thinking type, but to me he seemed like an introverted intuitive. But you find that the demon extroverted sensing, as it's called, or this inferior extroverted sensing, can really attack the introverted intuitive and put them into a binge where they're drinking tons of coffee and stimulants or alcohol or staying up late or doing drugs, or maybe they become obsessed with sex, or all of these things that for the extroverted sensing dominant they get to have, but they have in measure. The extroverted sensing type is a bon vivant who has lots of rich, delicious food and lots of romance and excitement and music and vitality. Well, this introverted intuitive, who can often be caricatured as someone lacking in these things, when they access their inferior extroverted sensing, they kind of get a taste of that, but they can become addicted to then being that bon vivant, and they can almost become demented by it. It's like the longer you spend, it irradiates you, and this extroverted sensing kind of comes out in this bizarro way and perverts the introverted intuitive or distorts them in the same way that an extroverted sensing type might become a little bit deranged by spending too much time alone in their introverted intuition. They might go crazy with these overwhelming insights and premonitions and visions and who knows what. So the extroverted sensing type sort of needs enough time to balance out by being around people. It can be very dangerous for them to spend a lot of time alone. Meanwhile, the introverted intuitive needs a lot of time alone to rebalance and kind of recalibrate with who they are internally, not through this extroverted sensing binge. They can kind of get into binges, and I can speak personally that it's a fine line between being on vacation, enjoying myself, sort of having this nice healthy pace in the extroverted sensory world, to then it only takes a couple nights of staying up all night, partying, and then pretty soon I'm in this like totally different alter ego, alternate self. I really should have we should all have different names for our inferior function self. It's like there's Jonah, and then there's Billy. And when Billy comes out, he just wants to drink and stay up all night and go dance at party and so on. And it's a very different character that comes out from the inferior function. Now, the older you get and the more you kind of slow down and go into the inferior function more and give it its due, you don't really get attacked by that. It doesn't overwhelm you as much. But for a lot of young introverted intuitives, they can be totally overwhelmed by the extroverted sensory inferior function that just grips them, and they kind of live out its story for a while. Okay, so I guess the last thing I want to say here then, and that's about it for the graphics, is when we look at the introverted intuitive, they have a great gift, and their gift is to weigh many factors at once, to take in a lot of sensory facts and sensory information, and kind of squint their eyes at it and not really pay attention to much to any of this or any of that, but then to get an impression, to sort of extract an impression that they get from it. Like they're taking the same way that an introverted sensing type might latch on to a few different details, introverted intuitives might go to check out a potential employer, and they spend the day there, and then at the end of it they have 5 little details from their day that each indicate a certain quality about that employer and whether that employer would be favorable or not, or a good fit or not, or things like that. So again, introverted intuition can almost look like a judging function because it can take in all this information, it can weigh out a lot of different details, then it can say, I had the sense that these people, it's almost like it can have a sense for the quality of life of that employer. The extroverted sensing is really taking in the holistic big picture of the outer, but the introverted intuition is then extrapolating certain big picture, universal guesses about what the big picture is, but it's doing it from tiny little details. It's sort of extrapolating and imagining. So it really is an imagining function and a knowing function. And that really shows that our imagination is related to our knowing. Extroverted intuitives are also very imaginative, but they are less interested in knowing because extroverted intuition is more about how something could connect to something else. It's not about some monolithic essence or truth or some ultimate belief or ideology or any of that stuff. So I would just say that introverted intuition is the cognitive function that is used to organize and narrow down internal impressions of hunches, guesses, premonitions, all sorts of things. And the introverted intuitive, because they have extroverted sensing inferior, can be perhaps the most detached from reality, or the most difficult for them to take action in reality. The stories of introverted intuitives from von Franz, Jung's star disciple, are great. She has 2 classic canonical stories of the introverted intuitives. The first one, and these are from lectures on Jung's typology. The first is a woman who saw von Franz who wanted to learn all about Greek mythology, and this woman was an introverted intuitive. Von Franz knew a lot about Greek mythology and wanted to teach her, but this woman didn't want to learn yet She wasn't ready, to take in the new information, which is something you'll find with a lot of introverted intuitives because they're so busy organizing what they already know and going over what they already know, and they're not really ready to take in anything new. But this woman did want to take some action in the outer world, and this is her extroverted sensing, right? For introverted intuitives, it can be profound to mail a letter. It can be profound. All sorts of extroverted sensing things can be totally profound because the extroverted sensing world can be kind of this magical place because the inferior function always imbues its contents with some magical numinous quality, this connection to the profound, right? So for this introverted intuitive, she's seeing von Franz, and von Franz wants to teach her, or rather she's telling von Franz, please teach me Greek mythology and Greek history and things like that. But before she can learn Greek mythology, she wants to build this map. And so this is her extroverted sensing, and it takes quite some time, and it's a big ordeal, and weeks go by and months go by, and finally she's built this map, and she's so proud of it. It's so profound to her, such a big deal to her, right? The inferior function is always such a big deal. So this introverted intuitive finally does this one thing and builds this map, and then she quits seeing von Franz as a tutor. Some years later, she runs into von Franz at a party. Von Franz sees her at the party, and they talk, and she profusely thanks von Franz for all von Franz taught her. And it's like, what did von Franz even teach her? She hadn't taught her a thing. But the introverted intuitive was so much in their own world, so much in their own bubble. And that's something that that all introverts can have. I mean, they really can, especially if they go in the extreme. But that was an extreme case of an extreme introverted intuitive. Not a lot of thinking involved, not a lot of feeling involved. You find these really polar cases sometimes. In other cases, people are more well-rounded. They're more socialized. They have to spend more time in thinking and feeling and things like that. But in some cases, you find these really extreme introverted intuitives, and everything for them is in this polarity, and it's always focused on its opposite counterbalance, which is the extroverted sensing. So you can find it with Christopher Hitchens, where he's kind of knocking on extroverted sensing, or you can find it with von Franz's patient, or not even patient, but student, who simply wanted to learn, but was unwilling to allow von Franz to teach. Instead, was so wrapped up in that inferior extroverted sensing. It was such this big problem of how do I make a map? I have to do this thing first. And it was a very nice map, a cloth map and ornate and all this stuff and painted. And it took weeks, months. So the introverted intuitive can get really wrapped up in their inferior extroverted sensing, which is really imbuing the outer world with this magical quality. Now, the second canonical story from von Franz, also from lectures on Jung's typology, is of a young man, an introverted intuitive, who was going to a dinner party. On his way there, stopped and wrote a poem because he was so inspired, and he kind of just drifted around, and he showed up 2 hours late with a bouquet of hand-picked flowers and so on. And her point with this, and by the way, that doesn't mean you're an introverted intuitive if you've done this. There are plenty of types who show up hours late. They're called 515s. I'm joking, but little human design joke there. But the introverted intuitive has this special relationship to the outer world, that the outer world is sort of, because their extroverted sensing is inferior, they imbue the outer world with all of this significance. Like, it's so meaningful that this flower could fall right here, or this feather could fall, or how beautiful that we got to catch this moment. There's a sort of specialness of the outer world and a connection, almost like seeing the whole universe in a kind of grain of sand, that whole William Blake theme, although Blake is thought to be a feeling dominant person. But nevertheless, there's this magical experience of the outer world, and the introverted intuitive themselves experiences the outer world. They experience it the most magically of all, but they can share their experience of it as magical with others. That's what I'm saying. For the introverted intuitive, their insights, their realizations are old hat. They're not really anything profound. I mean, they're not they just get them all the time, so it's cheap for them, it's free for them. What's really profound for them is taking action in the outer world, which for other people is quite mundane. They go, oh, you mailed a letter, big deal. Well, for the introverted intuitive, it is a big deal. Now, in that case, the introverted intuitive might not be able to share the magic of mailing the letter, but in another case, they can actually help you see how magical it really is that mail even works, and they can help you understand and go back maybe to ancient Egypt and how mail worked. This is actually a commonality the introverted intuitive has with the introverted sensing type, who might show you how incredible it is to be a tax, accountant or something that seems really boring, but then can be imbued with all this magic by seeing its connection to ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia or something like that. The introverted intuitive will also have this ability to sort of imbue outer actions and objects with this magical sense where kind of it seems more profound. You're getting a flower from them, but it's not just a flower. It seems like a more profound gift. And for most people, they're sort of flippant about the outer world. The outer world's not that profound at all. It's the inner world that's so profound. But here they're meeting somebody for whom the inner world is mundane. They eat the inner world for breakfast. They have it breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They live and breathe in this inner world all the time. And so for them, the outer world is what's so magical. So they can just kind of share that, and it can make others for whom the outer world is mundane get a newfound appreciation, a newfound understanding. Wow, it is kind of special. Wow, like staying up and seeing the sunrise, watching the sunset. These fundamental things in the outer world can seem so profound. For instance, when Jung himself an introverted intuitive, I know there's much debate about Jung and people think he's a thinking type and stuff like that. He's not. He's introverted intuitive. But for Jung, or at least that's my assessment, he really had this idea when he was studying different peoples, kind of doing his anthropological surveys. He kept finding commonalities, and he was so interested in these commonalities, and one that he found was sun worship. And then I think it was when he was in Africa, actually traveling through the brush, he woke up one morning and looked at the dawn, and he realized it was not sun worship. It was the worship of the coming of the dawn, because it's really scary sleeping outside in the dark, and when the dawn comes, you kind of are like, praise the God, that the sun is the God who has now brought the day and has come back to bless us, so we are not stuck in eternal night. Well, that kind of observation is a very introverted, intuitive observation about something that's seemingly very mundane, extroverted sensing thing, right? Like this outer world, the sun comes up. Okay, what's more mundane than that? The sky is blue, But if you can take something like that and make it profound and really appreciate the deep inner meaning of that, and even the sense of love that they felt, that the sun itself loved them and was protecting them and so on. And you yourself can feel this if you stay awake all night under certain circumstances and see the sun come up. And so that kind of thing is what the introverted intuitive is really here doing. They can get in a lot of trouble with their inferior function, as all types can, but they can also express a lot of their connection to the divine through their inferior function, which is really the function of accessing the outer world and being in the outer world, which is usually very mundane. I mean, the term mundane, mundus, meaning earth, of the earth. So, okay, well, I guess let's see if there's any final comments here. So just kind of how we've been looking so far, we have started with introverted sensing and extroverted intuition. After that, this time we'll be looking at introverted intuition, extroverted sensing. So what we've really been covering is the perceiving functions so far. And in the next two sessions, we're going to look at the judging functions and see some of the differences of the different attitudes of thinking and feeling. And then we'll kind of go beyond. But for introductory purposes, really starting with these 8 cognitive functions and not even worrying about the auxiliary or tertiary function, not worrying about the Myers-Briggs type or the objective personality subtype, not worrying about any of those details, just really zeroing in on what can we say fundamentally about people who prefer a particular cognitive function. There are 8 of them. What can we say about introverted intuitives? What can we say about extroverted sensing? And so on. So in these past 2 sessions, we've been looking at the perceiving types. These are irrational. Next, we're going to look at the rational types. And the rational types are so called because ratio, comparison, basically comparing one thing to another, putting them in ratio, measuring them, judging them, deciding which one to use and which one to discard, and so on. All of these sort of measurement, judging, deciding, this is all the realm of the rational. And that can be surprising for some people that sensing isn't rational, but it's not. A sensory fact is just a fact. There's a rock there. There's nothing rational about that rock being there. if I were to say, if we move this rock over there, and if we put it on this teeter-totter, and then the other side of the teeter-totter would go up higher because the rock would push it down, that might be rational. That's an example of thinking, right? I'm using thinking to show how the rock could gain leverage on a fulcrum point, and however that is, right? And then we could use that to lift another rock, for instance. That's thinking. But the sensory fact itself, the fact that the rock is there, or the fact even of a song, I mean, there's something really aesthetic about sensing. The fact of a song, the fact of a painting, the fact of an image or a photograph, the fact of a sunset. These are just sensory facts. And there's something really aesthetic and beautiful about sensing as a function. These are often very aesthetic people. And then you have introverted intuition. It's equally irrational, right? Just like last week when we saw introverted sensing and extroverted intuition. So these are all irrational. They're not really comparing and measuring. And so when we leave behind the perceiving, the irrational functions, we'll go into the rational functions. And that's really one of the biggest differences of all, honestly. I mean, that is a momentous difference, to leave behind the world of the amoral, non-moral, purely irrational, sensory and intuitive world, to leave that behind and go into the world where we're expected to judge things, and we're expected to be discriminating and discerning. We're expected to see if things work, and if they're logically sound, and if they're ethical, and if people like them or dislike them, and we're expected to care what people think. We're expected to be in this world of people. I mean, I had an introverted intuitive once tell me, I don't usually talk. I only talk when there's people around. And it's like, true, but like, I think what she meant was like, she doesn't even like talk or think in language or talk to herself or anything. Like, she's not even of language. There's something particularly about introverted intuition compared to the introverted sensing and extroverted intuition polarity, which is more linguistic somehow. But particularly with introverted intuition and extroverted sensing, it's almost as if the outer world is this real thing, this real fact. And then when we're in the world of language, we're really just doing whatever we can to kind of indicate to some outer fact. It's like the introverted intuition is the aha moment that goes, aha, I know what you mean. You mean that outer fact. Yes, that's what I mean. Aha, I know what you mean. You mean this outer fact. But it's kind of like, unless the person has had that experience, you can describe it, but all you can really do, I mean, they might not have that aha moment. But you can see that introverted intuition and extroverted sensing are almost non-linguistic. It's using language, but only as a means to point outside of language. Formerly, I mean, I guess I should say previously, looking at introverted sensing and extroverted intuition, there is a more linguistic element there, because the extroverted intuitive, as we know from people like Robin Williams, who are kind of our classic comedians, has a very verbal, witty, quick, their intuition is on the outside. Their use of the connection of language and so on is right on the tip of their tongue. So they tend to be a lot more quick-witted and kind of multivalent. Extroverted intuition is multi-contextual and kind of always changing contexts, shifting contexts rapidly. If you watch a TV show like Succession with a lot of quick, funny banter, most of that is extroverted intuition. The character of Roman from Succession is a classic extroverted intuitive dominant, and some of the other characters have secondary or tertiary extroverted intuition. So it's not the only quick, snappy one. You find a lot of snappy dialogue with extroverted sensing as well, but you do see that the extroverted intuitive, they're able to just really move freely around language. So that's something else we've seen. But regardless of that distinction, we've been entirely in the realm of perception so far, so I'm excited in our next session to dive into the world of judging and to kind of imagine what it is, or maybe you are a person who is a judging person and you've been imagining what it is to be a perceiving person, but if you're perceiving, to really imagine what it is to be someone who is on that thinking, feeling polarity. And so we'll be looking at that next week. For now, I would just say, yeah, if you yourself are an introverted intuitive or an extroverted sensing type, then this will be an especially important polarity for you. If not, it's still something you can learn about, and it's something you can maybe be interested in, or you know people on this polarity. But yeah, this is really, it's a polarity that has a lot to do with personal power and agency in the world. And it's a very non-linguistic kind of polarity. It's almost just about meaning that refers to the external, and it's this sort of feedback loop between external reality and internal meaning. And it's a very it's an interesting one because on the one hand, extroverted sensing seems to be the most basic and most normal and kind of just seeing the world as it is, just seeing external world objectively. But on the other hand, it is always inextricably linked to that internal belief system and that internal intuitive framework of interpretation and knowledge. And so it really is kind of that battle between the bottom-up sensory processing of the outer world and the top-down assumptions, hypotheses, and guesses of the introverted inner world. All right, thanks for watching, and come back next time where we will look at introverted feeling and extroverted thinking, and we'll make a foray into the judging types. Oh, they think they're so rational, don't they? Well, I suppose they are. Thanks for watching.